You see it every time you scroll through vacation photos. A white ship the size of a small city, gliding past a turquoise coastline. Thousands of people leaning over the railings with drinks in hand. It looks like pure leisure. A floating resort with nothing to worry about, but which pool to choose. But behind that ship sits one of the strangest, most capital-hungry businesses in the world. And the real economics behind it are far more interesting than you think. Because owning a cruise line isn't really a hospitality business. It's a shipbuilding business that happens to sell vacations. Let's talk about what it actually takes to own one. Start with the ship itself. A modern cruise ship isn't built. It's engineered, over years, in a handful of specialized shipyards in Europe and Asia that can even handle a project this size. A mid-size vessel runs you somewhere around $500 million. A true mega ship, the kind with water parks, ice rinks, and a dozen restaurants stacked over 20 decks, can cost close to $2 billion. Royal Caribbean's Icon of the Seas landed near that number. That's before you've sold a single ticket. Before a single guest has stepped on board. You are years into construction, tens of thousands of engineering man-hours deep, and you haven't earned a cent. Here's the part most people miss. You don't build one ship. You build a fleet, on a rolling schedule, because a single ship doesn't generate enough consistent cash flow to justify the corporate overhead of running a cruise line at all. Carnival, Royal Caribbean, and Norwegian all operate this way. New vessels ordered years in advance, delivered on a staggered timeline. So the company never has all its capital tied up in one hull at one moment. It's less like buying a boat and more like running a permanent, decades-long construction pipeline. So where does the money for that pipeline come from? Almost never entirely from cash reserves. Most cruise lines finance 70 to 80% of a new ship's cost through a mix of debt, export credit agencies, and shipyard financing arrangements. That means before your first ship even launches, you've taken on hundreds of millions in long-term debt, serviced over 10, sometimes 20 years. You are, in a very real sense, borrowing against vacations that haven't been booked yet. And the debt doesn't stop once the ship is delivered. Running that ship costs real money every single day it's at sea, whether it's full or half empty. Industry estimates put the operating cost of a large modern vessel somewhere around $200 million a year. For the biggest ships, the ones with water parks and multiple theaters, that number climbs past $300 million annually. Fuel alone can run tens of millions of dollars a month. Add port fees, food and beverage provisioning for thousands of guests and crew, maintenance, insurance, and payroll for a crew that can number in the thousands, and you start to understand why cruise lines think in decades, not seasons. A ship isn't a purchase. It's a recurring, multi-decade financial commitment that starts accruing cost the moment the keel is laid and doesn't stop until the vessel is finally retired or sold for scrap. There's also the question of where these ships get built at all. Only a handful of shipyards in the world, concentrated in places like Finland, France, Italy, and Germany, with growing competition from Asian yards, have the specialized infrastructure to construct a vessel this size. That scarcity gives the yards real leverage in negotiations, and it means your delivery date is only ever as reliable as a shipyard's backlog. Slip a delivery by even a year, and you've pushed back the revenue you were counting on to service the debt you already owe. Now here's a question. If the ship costs that much before it earns a dollar, how does anyone make this business work? The answer is volume, and a business model that would look bizarre in almost any other industry. Cruise lines sell the cabin itself at a razor-thin margin, sometimes barely above break-even. The ticket gets you in the door. It is functionally a loss leader, dressed up as a luxury purchase. The real profit engine sits on board, in everything that happens after check-in. Think about the last time you walked past a casino floor, a specialty restaurant, or a spa on a ship. That's not decoration. That's the business. Onboard spending, casinos, bars, shore excursions, specialty dining, Wi-Fi packages, photography, regularly makes up close to a third of total revenue for the major cruise lines. For some companies, ancillary spend has climbed even higher. The cabin gets you aboard. Everything else is where the actual profit lies. This is why cruise lines have become masters of dynamic pricing, borrowed almost directly from the airline industry. Prices for the same cabin shift daily based on demand, season, and how full the ship already is, all designed to maximize what economists call consumer surplus, squeezing the gap between what you'd pay and what you actually do. Meanwhile, the onboard economy runs on tiered packages, basic drink plans, premium drink plans, specialty dining add-ons, shore excursions bundled and upsold before you've even boarded. Every layer is engineered to convert a cheap ticket into an expensive week. Think about what that actually means for how you'd run the business if you owned it. Your entire onboard design becomes a funnel. The casino sits near the main walkways, not tucked away, because foot traffic is currency. The specialty restaurants are positioned to be visible from the free buffet, so the upgrade always feels one step away. Even cabin design plays into this. Entry-level interior cabins are deliberately modest, nudging guests toward balcony or suite upgrades that carry meaningfully higher margins. None of it is accidental. A cruise ship is, in a very real sense, a retail environment shaped like a hotel, and every hallway is a merchandising decision. Shore excursions deserve their own mention, because they reveal just how far the ancillary model extends. When your ship docks in a port, the line doesn't just drop you off. It sells you the snorkeling trip, the guided tour, the beach club day pass. Often through local operators the cruise line has struck exclusive or preferential deals with, taking a commission on nearly everything booked through the ship rather than arranged independently on shore. Guests who book directly with local operators, bypassing the ship's excursion desk, are functionally guests the company makes less money from. That single dynamic shapes everything from onboard signage to how excursions get priced. Then there's the part almost nobody thinks about: ownership. Most major cruise lines don't fly the flag of the country where they're headquartered. Carnival Corporation is legally domiciled in Panama. Royal Caribbean is incorporated in Liberia. This isn't a loophole. It's a foundational part of the business model, known in the industry as flags of convenience. Registering ships under certain foreign flags means lighter labor regulation, different tax treatment, and crews hired globally rather than under the more expensive labor laws of the country where the company is headquartered. It's one of the reasons a Carnival ship can operate profitably at fares that would be unthinkable for a labor cost structure based purely in the United States. Who's actually involved in getting a ship from empty steel to full occupancy? More people than you'd expect. Naval architects and engineering firms who designed the vessel years before steel is cut. Shipyards, often state-subsidized in the countries that host them, competing fiercely for these contracts because a single order can define years of their revenue. Port authorities in every destination, who charge docking and passenger fees that scale with ship size, a cost that adds up fast when you're calling on a dozen ports a season. Export credit agencies, essentially government-backed lenders, who help finance the ship because the shipbuilding country wants the jobs the contract creates. Travel agencies and booking platforms, who still drive a significant share of cabin sales and take a commission for it. And thousands of crew members, hired through international labor markets, working under contracts that look nothing like standard shore-based employment. That flag of convenience structure is worth sitting with for a moment longer because it explains so much of the industry's actual profitability. When Carnival registers a ship in Panama or Royal Caribbean registers one in Liberia, they're not hiding from anyone. They're opting into a regulatory framework built specifically to serve international shipping, with different tax exposure and different labor standards than the country where the company's headquarters and executives actually sit. Combine that with a workforce hired globally, often from countries where the wages offered are highly competitive relative to the local economy, even though they'd be considered modest by Western standards, and you start to see how a cruise line manages to sell a week-long vacation, room, food, and entertainment included, for a few $100s a person. It's not a discount. It's a structurally different cost base than almost any land-based hospitality business could ever achieve. Which brings us to the challenges. Because this business, for all its size, is fragile in ways people don't expect. The first is fuel. A large ship can burn tens of thousands of gallons a day, and fuel costs are almost entirely outside your control. When oil prices spike, so does your single largest operating expense, and you can't exactly renegotiate the ocean. The second is debt servicing. Remember that 70 to 80% financed on every new ship. Interest payments on that debt run for years, sometimes decades, regardless of how full your ships are that quarter. A downturn in travel demand doesn't pause your loan payments. The third is capacity risk. Cruise ships take 3 to 4 years to build from order to delivery. You're essentially forecasting demand half a decade into the future and betting a $2 billion asset on being right. Order too many ships heading into a downturn, and you've built expensive capacity nobody wants to fill. Order too few heading into a boom, and your competitors capture the growth while your yards are still years from delivering. Unlike a hotel, you can't quietly close a few floors during a slow season. A ship at sea is either sailing, fully staffed and fully costed, or it's sitting in dry dock, earning nothing while still accruing maintenance and financing costs. There is very little middle ground. The fourth is regulation and geopolitics. Port access, environmental rules around emissions and fuel type, and health regulations all shift constantly, and a single policy change in a popular destination market can force an entire itinerary redesign. And the fifth, maybe the most underestimated, is reputational fragility. A single viral incident, a health outbreak on board, an environmental violation, a safety failure, can dent bookings across an entire brand for months, even if the incident itself was isolated to one ship. So if you were seriously considering this, not the fantasy version, the actual industry, where would you start looking? You'd start by understanding that this is not a business you enter with a single ship and modest ambitions. The capital intensity essentially forces you towards scale from day one, which is why the industry is dominated by a small handful of global players rather than a long tail of small operators the way, say, restaurants or hotels are. This is also why the handful of companies that do dominate the space guard their scale so aggressively. Once you own dozens of ships and decades of relationships with shipyards, port authorities, and export credit agencies, you've built a moat that a new entrant would need billions of dollars and a decade of patience just to begin approaching. If you wanted real exposure to this economics without building a fleet yourself, publicly traded cruise operators give you a way to study and even invest in this exact business model without personally financing a $2 billion ship. Watching their quarterly earnings calls is genuinely one of the clearest windows into how a capital-heavy, ancillary revenue business actually thinks about growth. Pay attention to two numbers specifically whenever a cruise operator reports earnings: occupancy, which tells you how close the fleet is running to full capacity, and onboard revenue per passenger, which tells you how effectively the ship is converting a cheap ticket into the real profit sitting behind it. Those two figures, tracked over several quarters, tell you almost everything about the underlying health of the business, far more than the headline ticket prices ever will. And here's the counterintuitive truth at the center of all of it. The ship isn't the product. It's the delivery mechanism. The actual product is everything that happens once you're trapped, happily, thousands of miles from land, with nowhere else to spend your money. Cruise lines didn't build an industry around transportation. They built one around captive spending, dressed up as paradise. Next time you see that photo of a white ship gliding past a turquoise coastline, you'll see it differently. Not a vacation. A floating balance sheet, engineered down to the dollar, designed to turn a razor-thin cabin fare into a resort's worth of margin before you ever see land again.